Battlebots is a robotic competition that has been going on for quite some time now, and we all know what Battlebots is, and it's about a robot fighting stuff. And if you don't know what Battlebots is, you're lying to your friends, you're lying to yourself, and worst of all, you're lying to me, which is fucking horrible. I don't know how you could do that. But we've had Battlebots for over 20 years now, and of that time we've had almost 10 seasons, and 24 championships. So, it's time to ask the question, which Battlebots championship fight was the best? Well, I have come up with the amazing conclusion. I have made a tier list of all 24 Battlebots championships to see which one is truly the best way to finish a season off. Now, I can't show any of the fight footage here, be in fear that I'm going to get triple whammy copy striked by Comedy Central, ABC, and Discovery. So I'm just going to show some pictures of the championships, and I'm going to break them down a little bit and give my opinion on each championship. The first fight of the championship of Battlebots ever was Backlash versus Alpharaptor. Now, not much happened here. All that happened was Alpharaptor was having some kind of drive problems, and then Backlash managed to do some damage to the rear side of Alpharaptor, and that was it. Backlash won by KO. Now, in terms of championship, this is a pretty lackluster one, as we didn't see anything from either opponent, and I don't think that this was just not an entertaining championship, especially to be the first championship we get of Battlebots. So I'm probably going to give it a D tier because I don't think it was horrendously awful. I mean, Backlash did show some entertaining damage. It just wasn't damage that was like, oh my god, that was amazing damage. And we didn't see much from Alpharaptor either. So I'm going to give it a D tier. Also, I will be putting each fight that I found in the description, so don't think that you won't be able to see the fight, because I will have each fight that I was able to find in the description. Keep in mind, though, some of these fights were also put into fight compilations. I got some of these fights from Blooper Spoof, who does compilations of a lot of Battlebots and Robot Wars robots. Go check him out. But usually if there's a bot that has multiple fights in the video, the championship fight will usually be put in the description, so just look for that if you can't find it. Next up is Vlad the Impaler versus Voltronic. Now, this is another fight that was kind of lackluster because Voltronic didn't really do anything, and Vlad kind of just got one hit on him. I will say, though, and they weren't really doing anything much after that one hit. I mean, Vlad was kind of trying to do some kind of sexual assault on Voltronic, and Voltronic was just letting that happen, so I guess that's kind of funny. But other than that, this fight was pretty basic, not perfect. I will give it a C just because that Vlad being stuck on top of Voltronic was kind of funny, but I don't think it's a fight that I would go and say, wow, that was an amazing championship. Next up is Hazard versus Dead Blow. This fight, much like the other two, wasn't that great, although I will say that unlike the other two fights, Dead Blow did manage to at least put up somewhat of a fight on Hazard. The fight itself, though, it's just a bit too fast for me. I don't think that we got to see enough from either robot. Hazard was just being Hazard, and Dead Blow just took a ton of damage. So I think I'm going to give this fight I'm going to let this fight be a C tier as well. But this is definitely on the higher end of the C tiers, I do think, in my opinion. Up next, we got Minion and Dual, and yes, I know you guys are probably going to call me out on this, but I know that I said Voltark wrong, and I just noticed that, so apologies for that. But as I said, we got Minion versus Dual, and this is kind of a weird fight because Dual kind of just, I thought that was another Treadbot that I literally forgot the name of. Ronin. It looked a lot like Ronin, which was weird to me. But this wasn't really, this was kind of just a dominating performance by Minion. It just took Dual with the back wedge and kind of just pushed Dual around everywhere. Overall, I do think out of all the championships of the first season, I do think this is definitely the best one, as both bots were at the very least working, and Minion did show some great driving. So overall, I will give this a B tier. Going into Season 2, we have Backlash versus Ziggo. Now, this was a freaking boring fight. Nothing happened in the slightest, and it was just Ziggo was having issues and Backlash was having issues, and then Backlash basically just flipped itself out of nowhere. I'm gonna give this an F tier, and please hear me out on this. While I do think Backlash versus Alpharaptor was very anticlimactic, I do think that at the very least, Backlash did a little bit of impressive damage. But this fight, neither bots were working. At the very least, Backlash was working for some of it. But this fight was just very, very, very just disappointing. Next, we have Spaz versus El Diablo. This is another fight where it did go to the judges, but I don't think it was that amazing of a fight anyway. In fairness, El Diablo did do some stuff at the beginning, but that was about it, as it took some damage to its tread, and it basically lost half its drive for a long bit of it, and it basically couldn't do much with Spaz, so Spaz was kind of just dominating the fight for the most part. There's not much to say about the Spaz El Diablo fight. I was thinking about giving it a B tier because both bots were technically working, but I don't think it's that amazing of a fight, so I'm going to give it a C tier. Next up is Biohazard versus Vlad the Impaler. And I found this fight very entertaining for the most part. This was an overall pretty close fight. I mean, Biohazard did dominate, but Vlad definitely showed some aggression out there. I did like a lot of the stuff that Biohazard was doing and a lot of stuff that Vlad was doing. I don't think this was like an amazing fight because like there wasn't a lot of like hits that you could say, geez, that was an amazing shot. Like, I can't believe that actually happened. But no, this is just a fight that I feel is pretty great. So I'm going to give Biohazard versus Vlad the first A tier. I don't think it's S tier because I don't think this fight was like completely amazing, because I do feel like if Vlad did a bit more, then I feel like I could have given this an S tier, because when I think of S tier fights, I think of fights where both opponents are doing like great. Like, you can't tell who has the advantage until the very end of it. So that's why I'm giving Biohazard versus Vlad an A tier, because I do feel like Biohazard had the advantage at the end of it. Next up is Dissector versus Atomic Wedgie. Now, we got Donald Hudson, the man with 6 giant nuts in his belt, I guess, who just completely dominated this fight against Atomic Wedgie. It was just taking Atomic Wedgie wherever it wanted. And this was a pretty decent fight. I don't think it was amazing because we didn't see a lot of the great lifts that Dissector have been able to pull off. He was kind of just lifting Atomic Wedgie like a few inches in the air, not that much. And I did consider giving this fight a B tier, but I think I'm going to give it a C tier because Dissector did show some problems at the end of the fight, where he was getting stuck inside of the screws. So I think I'm going to give this fight a C tier. I do think it's on the higher end of most of the C tier fights, though. Next up, we have Dr. Inferno Jr. versus Gamma Raptor. This is, in my opinion, a very disappointing championship. Like, while Backlash and Alpharaptor and Backlash versus Ziggo were pretty bad fights overall, I find this to be a very decent fight because both bots were working pretty well early on. The sad thing is, though, neither bot did much to the other, and Dr. Inferno Jr. did win in the end, but it was just a fight where I feel like, man, both of these bots could have done a whole lot more in this championship, and sadly, we didn't really get to see that in this championship, so I think I'm going to give Doctor versus Gamma a C. Next up, we have Hazard versus the Little Drummer Boy, and this was another just massive murder fest for Hazard, as usual. Hazard was just tearing pieces apart of Little Drummer Boy, and I thought this fight was overall good, but I don't think it's amazing. I think as I said, I want both bots. When I think of like amazing fights, I think of both bots doing very well in the fight, and unfortunately we didn't really get to see that from Little Drummer Boy. Little Drummer Boy didn't do much to Hazard. The only time it did anything to Hazard is when it got under Hazard like once, and that was about it. It didn't do anything with Hazard after that. So I'm probably going to give this a C tier. I was considering B tier because of how much damage Hazard did, but I'm going to give it a C because this was another pretty disappointing fight. Now, I know what you're thinking. Civilian, do you have any fights that will not be in the C tier? Well, congratulations. You just jinxed yourself because now we have Sao versus Biohazard. This is an S tier fight all fucking day. There is like it has everything you want. It has two opponents that are both going at each other. Amazing damage, amazing control, just an amazing fight overall. And no, I'm not going to spoil what happens in this fight because you're not going to get it spoiled. What you're going to do is you're going to go in the description, find the Sao versus Biohazard fight, and you're going to watch the fight. But yeah, this is an easy S tier. This is easily one of the best fights in Battlebots history. Easily one of, if not the best championship in Battlebots history. Just an amazing fight overall. I apologize for the video quality of the fight that I put in the description when it comes to Gladiator versus Minion, but I sadly couldn't find a fight that wasn't this. I couldn't even find one from Blooper. But next we have Minion versus Gladiator, and this is overall a good fight. I wouldn't say this is perfect because in the beginning, Gladiator had a couple problems. It got stuck on the wall a few times, and it did manage to make up for that. And I do think it was overall a pretty good show from Gladiator. Gladiator did win by judge's decision. I do think that this fight, though, could have been better because Minion's been a pretty great driver, and Gladiator is also a pretty good driver. These are both very talented robots. And much like Dr. Inferno Jr. versus Gamma Raptor, I think we could have seen a lot more. However, I do think this is much better than the Doctor versus Gamma fight. So I will give this a B tier. I was considering C tier, but I don't think that it had a lot bad going for it. So I think a B is appropriate for this fight. Next, we have Ziggo versus the Big B. Now, in all honesty, this was a pretty close fight overall. I mean, yeah, Big B was taking some damage, but it was also handling Ziggo quite well. Ziggo did manage to win, however, in a judge's decision. So, yeah, but I do think this was an overall pretty entertaining fight. especially after some of the lackluster fights we just saw. Overall, this was a pretty good fight. I will give this an A tier, as both bots did show a lot of aggression and a lot of damage in their own way. Big B did control the fight for some of it, and Ziggo did a ton of damage. Easily the best lightweight championship so far. Next up on the block, we got Hazard versus Complete Control. This is probably, in my opinion, my favorite Hazard championship, because Hazard did manage to do a lot. Like, I was considering, I was a little torn on where to put this, but Hazard was like making a statement at the end of it. It just tore Complete Control, all of Complete Control's armor off immediately at the end of the fight. And that did it in for me. I'm going to give this an A tier. The only reason it's not an S tier is because Complete Control didn't really do much in the ways of damaging Hazard. It was more of Hazard's fight to lose, and it won. So I am going to give it an A tier. It's still a pretty great fight, though. Next up, we have Biohazard versus Overkill. This is probably the funniest fight I've ever watched, as Overkill was just bouncing around all the time. It was like bouncing off of walls, like it just took like 10 pounds of sugar at 8 o'clock at night. So, I mean, this was overall a pretty entertaining fight, and Biohazard once again dominating its championship as always. I don't think this is Biohazard's best championship, though, as Overkill didn't do a lot to Biohazard besides just jump around and just kind of be a nuisance towards Biohazard instead of actually like doing anything. So I'm going to give this a B tier, because I don't think it's at the quality of an A tier like what I've described with like Ziggo versus Big B or Hazard versus Complete Control, but this is still a pretty great fight. Next up, we have Toro versus New Cruelty. Now, I thought this was going to be a very strange fight, because I honestly didn't think New Cruelty was in the finals from what I remember. So I didn't really remember this championship as much as others. And honestly, it's not that forgettable of a championship. This was a good Toro domination fight. And this fight is kind of just proof that one flip from an inertia-led robot would just end your day immediately and kind of just screw you up for the fight to come. So, and Toro did win by judge's decision, and New Cruelty did do a little bit too. It dominated Toro for like the first half of the fight, but then the second half of the fight was easily Toro's fight. So this was kind of a back and forth fight, but I don't think there was a lot of impressive hits in the fight. So I will give this a B tier, because I don't think it's at the near quality of an A tier, but this is still a great fight. Don't let me say that this is a shit fight, because this is a pretty good fight. Next up, we have Dr. Inferno Jr. versus Wedge of Doom. Now, first of all, what the hell was that judge's decision? That judge's decision made no sense whatsoever. Now, besides that, this fight was better than the Dr. Inferno Jr. fight. I do think Dr. Inferno Jr. did do much more, and Wedge of Doom did do a lot more too. This was not as much a dominating fight as it was a back and forth fight, but not like an amazing back and forth fight. I do think that this is a good fight, but I don't think it's an amazing fight. I was considering giving this fight a C tier, but after more consideration, I'm going to give it a B tier, just because this was much better than Dr. Inferno Jr. versus Gammaraptor. So this was overall a good fight. Next up is SOB versus T-. This was another fight where Inertia Labs just dominated, as they usually do. This was overall a pretty all right fight. I mean, I don't think it was amazing, but it was nice to see T minus get some good flips in. The thing that was kind of disappointing is that we didn't get to see that Saw of SOB in action. This was kind of just like a fight between two different strategies, and I think only one strategy in that worked. So I considered giving this a B, but I'm actually going to give this a C tier. But this is probably the best C tier out of all of these. The only way this could get a B tier is if SOB did a bit more. I don't think this could have gotten A tier or S tier, though, in my opinion. Next up, we have Biohazard versus Voltronic. Now, I don't think this fight was kind of just a kind of disappointing way to end off Biohazard's career for Battlebots. I mean, it did fight a bit more. As we know, it got retired against Megabyte, and that's how it ended. But in like televised Battlebots, this would be Biohazard's last fight. And I don't think it was that great of a fight. I think Biohazard could have done a lot more. It managed to knock out Voltronic by pinning it against the wall, and that's kind of a disappointing way to knock out your opponent. Yeah, Biohazard is a control bot, so it's going to do that. But I just wish that we saw a bit more of Voltronic here, because I do think Voltronic is a good design. And I want to see I wanted to see more of Biohazard, because Biohazard is definitely my favorite it was probably my favorite Comedy Central BattleBot. So I'm going to give this fight a C tier, because I don't think that this was a great way to end off Comedy Central for the heavyweight division. I think out of all the Season 5 fights, like the Season 5 championship fights, I think this is probably my least favorite one, at least in my opinion. Next up, we have Dissector versus Gladiator. I mean, Gladiator? Yes, Dissector versus Gladiator. I'm not sure how I got confused on that. But this is overall a pretty great way to end off the Comedy Central days for BattleBots. I think this is an overall pretty good fight. Both Dissector and Gladiator did a lot to each other. I mean, this was a definite control bot battle. Both bots were aggressive. Both bots did a lot. And this was a pretty great way to end off the season of BattleBots. Just a great driving from Donald Hudson. Great driving from the Gladiator driver. I forget who his name was, but you, sir, are a true driving master in the sport, and just a great job driving in that fight. Now, I was considering giving this an A tier, but after close consideration, I am actually going to give this an S tier, and here is why. This is the last championship of BattleBots. Now, this was a terrific way to cap off the Comedy Central BattleBots era. So, because of that, I think I'm going to give it an S tier because of that reason. I don't think it's as good as Son of Waiachi versus Biohazard, but I still think that this is an amazing fight that I'm sure everyone would love to watch. Now going into the reboot era, we have Tombstone versus Bite Force. Now, overall, this was a pretty decent fight. I mean, overall, I guess, but I mean, there wasn't a lot that Tombstone did in this fight because it smoked out at the beginning, and then Bite Force ended up with some tread damage, I think, and had some driving troubles. So both robots were kind of just limping towards the bell at the end of it. But Bite Force did win the decision and is the first of many of his giant nut victories. And I don't think this was an amazing fight. I mean, Tombstone had dealt with damage against his Bronco fight, and that's what happened. So overall, pretty disappointing fight. I'm going to give this a C tier because this fight was kind of just disappointing, but it wasn't horrendously terrible like Backlash versus Alpharaptor or Backlash versus Ziggo. This was an overall okay fight. Not an amazing fight, but I mean, I wouldn't hate having to watch this fight again. Now, a championship I don't like is Bombshell versus Tombstone. Because, my God, this was just a completely one-sided the entire time. Which I guess if you like one-sided fights or if you love Tombstone, that's fine. And this may be a bit biased, but I am a Bombshell fan. So it was kind of just disappointing to see Bombshell get destroyed like that. I'm not saying I would have been fine. I wouldn't be fine if Bombshell lost, but I mean, you want to see more from this dark horse that just beat Minotaur, took out Poison Arrow, took out Red Devil, took out Cobalt. You'd want to see more from Bombshell, but because of the damage it took from Minotaur, we couldn't see its vertical spinner in action once again, so we didn't get to see that. I don't think this fight is like horrendously terrible. Like, this isn't a fight that I despise or anything. This is just a championship that I'm not a huge fan of. So I'm going to give this fight a D tier. I don't think it's as the poor quality of Backlash versus Ziggo, but I do think of the reboot era, this is easily the worst championship. Now, reversing from what I just said, we now have Minotaur versus Bite Force, which is easily the best championship of the reboot era. This was just an amazing fight overall. Minotaur doing damage, Bite Force doing damage, both bots like doing a pushing battle at the second half, and then Bite Force out of nowhere getting its weapon back up to speed and just ending the Brazilian team's entire career. So I do think this is a pretty amazing fight overall. I don't think it's the best Battlebots fight ever, but I still think that this is an S tier worthy championship. I'm pretty torn between which one I like more, between Sao and Biohazard or Bite Force and Minotaur. I think I'm more lenient towards Sao and Biohazard, though, because it seems like that fight was a bit more revolutionary in the Battlebots community. Like, a lot of people saw that fight and like, oh my god, that was an amazing fight. I should build a Battlebot so I can be in amazing fights like that. It kind of like inspired a lot of builders. I'm not saying Minotaur and Bite Force didn't do that, but it just seemed like Sao and Biohazard was just a bit more like that. Whatever. But to cap off our tier list, we have Bite Force versus Witch Doctor, the bot no one knew would get into the finals versus the bot everyone knew would get into the finals. Yeah, this is overall a pretty decent fight, in my opinion. I mean, Witch Doctor came this close to beating Bite Force. It took out most of the wedgelets, and then it just got knocked out immediately. So I don't think this is as amazing as people like to say it is. I wish there was a bit more damage from that both bots could give. I don't think this isn't as amazing as people say it is. I mean, this fight kind of gets treated like it's the second coming of Christ or something, like it's this amazing fight or anything, but I don't think so. Yeah, so get ready. I'm giving Bite Force versus Witch Doctor a B tier.